Good morning, everyone. It's really good to see everyone here this morning. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Alzheimer's and dementia is actually close to many of us. My father suffers from Alzheimer's. I think there's probably no one in this room who doesn't know someone who is in that position. It's a growing thing, I think, that worries us as we become more aged population in general. And yet what's interesting is we don't really know why, and we don't really know what dementia is actually about. And so it's really very much at the frontier of where science is, understanding the brain, understanding memory, understanding how we are humans in some kind of way, and what happens when it goes wrong, and how in the end we can treat things like that, not to make us live long or anything else, but to have us have a more civil and productive older age. So it's a really interesting topic, I think, one that affects all of us, and I'm so pleased that we've got Muireann Irish here today to speak to us about this. Muireann is the University of Sydney's Brain and Mind Research Centre, which is a very interesting place. If you've never visited, it's full of lots of different people involved in very different elements of what happens with the brain, what happens with the mind, what happens with disadvantaged youth, with a whole range of different aspects which are really to do with the mind and the way that it engages with society in different ways. And I think these sorts of centres that are very multidisciplinary, that bring together lots of different people like this, are the way of the future in a lot of the research that we do. So I'm very pleased that Muireann is here today to talk to us. Muireann first came to Australia back, I think, before 2010, actually, talking to you earlier, which says 2010 here, and was fortuitous for us at least, found a postdoc at UNSW, where she could pursue her interests in memory and the process of memory and retention. And in 2012, she secured an ARC Early Researcher Award, a Future Fellowship, in 2016, and a number of other awards. So she is now an associate professor at the University of Sydney, and she's an associate investigator at the memory node of the ARC Centre of Excellence in Cognition and Disorders. Muireann's many accolades include being awarded the 2016 New South Wales Premier's Prize for Science and Engineering as an early career researcher. In 2017, she also received the L'Oreal UNESCO International Rising Talent Award. She was recognised by the Science and Technology Australia as a superstar of STEM in her passionate advocacy for women in science. So I'm really pleased to welcome you today to our breakfast seminar. I kind of feel a bit of an attachment to this because close to 9 or even 10 years ago now, I was actually the first speaker at one of these breakfast awards, and I think there was only about 20 of us, and we were in a room in the MLC Centre. So it's magnificent to see how much it's expanded and how much more it's engaged in the world today. So please join me in welcoming Muireann to the stage. Memory and Dementia, Past, Present and Future.
Thank you very much, Hugh, for that kind introduction. And I want to just say thank you to Mary O'Kane, the outgoing Chief Scientist, for inviting me to present my work here today. So, as Hugh's mentioned, memory is a topic I think that we're all aware of. We all think about our memory, but there's so much that we need to learn and to understand about how the brain actually supports these complex aspects of reliving the past. And so I'm going to present a sort of a brief snapshot of some of the projects that we've been undertaking at the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney, just to give an overview of how complex memory is, how important it is for us, for our sense of self, and also to think about what it might be like if you started to lose aspects of your memory and what that might mean for you in terms of your sense of self. And so I'm quite fascinated by the brain. I think it's one of the most enigmatic and puzzling things on the planet at the moment, that we have approximately 1.3 kilos of grey and white matter sitting in our skulls, encased in this little tomb, and yet we know very little about how it can achieve these complex feats of science, technology. All of the products of modern day civilization have stemmed from this little blob of grey and white matter. And so one of the things that I try to do in my research is to understand how damage to the brain actually disrupts very complex and sophisticated feats of cognition. And so I think if we just want to take a moment to think about memory in all its many guises, it's important to think about what memory actually means to us. So we talk about memory in very broad terms, but I think you need to remember that memory serves a number of different functions and purposes in our daily lives, some of which are it allows us to connect with others. So we share our experiences. We're fundamentally social creatures, and one of the ways in which we bond is to create links between people based on our past experiences. Memory confers a sense of who we are. It grounds us. It gives us a sense of identity and continuity, a sense of self. Our memories help us to plan, to predict, and to anticipate. And I'll focus on this in the second half of the talk, where I talk about the future-oriented aspects of memory and how important it is to have memory to enable us to think about ourselves in the future. Our memories are precious. I don't think there's anybody in the audience who would doubt how important our memories are. I think about the memories that I've already acquired of my 2 little boys and how devastated I would be if I were ever to lose these memories. We might also think about how our memories are maybe not as sharp as they used to be. I'm currently running on very sleep-deprived memory because I have a 5-month-old, and so I know what it's like to feel fuzzy and to not have as strong or as keen a sense of memory as I used to. And then when our memory becomes vulnerable, as we see in older age and in individuals who have dementia, this can be a time of severe vulnerability. And to think about losing your memory or to losing aspects of memory and how it might impact across all of these other functions that I've mentioned. So if we think about memory, inevitably we might draw upon some of our favourite memories from our past. And so whenever I think about some of my favourite memories, I'm instantly transported back to St. John's Road in Wexford in Ireland. And this was where my grandmother's house was. And so I can actually place myself back in the kitchen of her little house called Ivera on St. John's Road. And so it's very dimly lit, but I can see her kind of pottering away in the kitchen. She's wearing one of her tartan skirts. She's pulling out her famous apple tarts from the oven. There's a smell of fresh pastry. There's a smell of sweet apples. She's asking me, have I got any exercise to do, which was her way of talking about homework. And so it's a feeling, more so than even these sensory perceptual details, there's a feeling of safety, of comfort, of warmth, and of love. But also when I look back on these memories, they're tinged actually with some element of sadness, because my grandmother actually went on to get Alzheimer's disease. And so I watched as her memory, which was so sharp, began to degrade as I grew up, and eventually she succumbed to this illness. And so that's one of the reasons why I was propelled to study memory, why I'm really interested in what's happening in dementia, and why I think it's so important that we need to tackle these issues. And so my memory has since been transformed because it's tinged with sadness now. And this shows how memory actually is more of a constructive endeavour, that our memories change every time that we remember them, every time that we relive them. And that's the nature of memory. And so there are many different types of memory. We tend to think of memory as being a unitary sort of phenomenon, but in fact we have many different types. So we have episodic memory, which is event-based memory, and this is the type that we generally talk about, such as our wedding day or first day at school. We also have semantic knowledge, and these are the 2 types of memory that I'll focus on today in this talk, and how episodic memory may be facilitated by our general knowledge of the world around us, our memory for dates, facts, concepts, objects. We also have spatial memory and procedural memory, but I won't get into those as much today. And so episodic memory, this refers to our ability to remember and to retrieve episodes from the past. And so these can range in complexity from you trying to remember what you need to pick up in terms of a grocery list to propelling yourself back in time to relive evocative events from the past. And we commonly tend to think that our episodic memory is like an archive where we go back in and we dip in and we pick out a video or a store or a complete sort of replication of an event that we originally experienced. But in fact, memory does not work like this. And it's much more like this. So memory is constructive. Every time that you try to remember an event, what you're doing is pulling together the different details of the original experience and recombining them into a new memory trace. And so every time you relive an event, you're actually creating a new memory trace and reliving a new memory trace. This is why memory is so vulnerable to distortion and to error, because someone can give you some new information when you're retrieving, and that may be co-opted into your memory. So we don't have a permanent record that we reproduce every time we're remembering an event. More so, we're reconstructing the original experience. So for a long time, the neuroanatomy of episodic memory has really focused on one central player within the brain. And so this is the seahorse-shaped hippocampus, so called because it resembles the shape of a seahorse. And so this structure is located deep inside the medial temporal lobes of the brain. You can see it here in yellow underneath the hippocampus label. And so for many years, it was thought that the hippocampus was the sole repository of episodic memory. Lesion studies show that damage to the hippocampus irrevocably affected the capacity to encode and to store new memories. But we actually know now, with the advent of functional neuroimaging techniques, that when healthy individuals are retrieving events from their past, a whole distributed network is implicated. So the hippocampus certainly is important, but it's not sitting in there on its own. It's communicating with regions in the front of the brain and in posterior parietal regions near the back of the brain. And so we're talking now about moving towards a network-oriented view of memory, meaning that damage to any of these centers or any of these nodes of the network will affect the capacity to remember. And so when we think about memory, it's interesting to note that many of the syndromes in which memory is vulnerable show marked atrophy or damage to these centers of the brain's core recollective or core memory network. And so the famous Irish writer Jonathan Swift had made this prescient observation that he pointed to a diseased elm tree, I think, and he said, "I shall be like that tree. I shall die from the top." And he was referring to the fact that he was worried about his brain becoming vulnerable to dementia, dying from the top, meaning that he would lose his cognitive faculties rather than being physically impaired. And so the illness that he so feared now strikes many, many people that we know ourselves personally. We know that dementia is a pressing concern of our aging society. I think there would be very few in this room here who don't know somebody who has succumbed to dementia or is currently experiencing some of the cognitive and behavioural complaints of dementia. And I think there's a real imperative now to understand what is happening in the brains of someone who has dementia and what can we actually do to support them in living the best possible life that they can. So when we talk about dementia, it's important to note that there are many different types of dementia. It is not just one unitary entity. And so there are two dementia syndromes that I'll be referring to today, the most common of which is Alzheimer's disease. And so we know that Alzheimer's disease is predominantly a syndrome that affects episodic memory. I'll also refer to frontotemporal dementia, most specifically a syndrome called semantic dementia. And this, as the name might suggest, affects semantic knowledge. And I'm going to describe how these two dementia syndromes have provided us with really illuminating insights into the architecture of memory and what we know now about the processes that are important to enable us to not only remember the past, but to project forwards in time and to envisage the future. So in Alzheimer's disease, here we can see two brains. The brain on the left is the healthy brain, and we're looking at an Alzheimer's brain on the right. And so atrophy or pathology typically emerges in the medial temporal lobes of the brain. And so the two areas that are highlighted here show where there is bilateral hippocampal atrophy. So the hippocampus is being eroded slowly away in the brain. And this has marked impact on the ability to store and encode new memories, but also to retrieve memories that are older and from the more remote past. And so some of the clinical features of Alzheimer's disease undoubtedly impact memory. So there's a decline in episodic memory, which is most noticeable in terms of the individual not being able to remember recently experienced events. They're unable to encode the details or to encode the overall crux of events that they've recently experienced. They may also exhibit a disorientation to time and place, so being unaware of maybe what the date is or where they are in space. And as I've said, this atrophy in the medial temporal lobes initially is the precursor to many different cognitive complaints. Ultimately, the atrophy then spreads to adjacent prefrontal regions and also to regions in the parietal lobes. And these are some of the key regions in that memory circuit that I mentioned to you earlier. So Alzheimer's disease offers us a unique glimpse into the pathology or disruption of that episodic memory network. And here's a quote from one of our Alzheimer patients. When I asked him to retrieve an event from his recent past, he simply said, "I don't know what I did. I don't think I did anything exciting. But you don't tend to do anything exciting at my age." So he gave a very sort of overgeneral sort of qualification as to why he couldn't remember. So what would it be like to live with Alzheimer's disease? We talk about these terms and these sort of clinical symptoms, but it's quite divorced from what the experience would be like of the individual. And so just to sort of hammer the point home of how difficult and how disorienting it might be, we know that our patients who see us in the clinic have profound difficulties remembering recent events. It can be extremely jarring then to be told, "Oh, you were there, you remember that we did this," or to be reminded of facts and experiences that they can no longer actually retrieve because they were unable to encode the experience. They also show prospective memory impairments. So these are impairments in being able to remember to carry out actions, such as taking medication, remembering appointments, remembering to eat, remembering to pick up milk or to restock the fridge. They show, as I mentioned already, spatial disorientation, even becoming spatially confused within familiar settings, such as their own house, forgetting where to go to pick up, go to the post office or to go and collect medication. There's a difficulty with planning, with remembering sequences of events, and with being able to carry out what we would take for granted, such as cooking or making even a cup of tea. All of this can impact dramatically on their functional activities of daily life and can mean sometimes that safety and well-being of the individual is compromised. So everyday activities such as shopping, counting out change, ordering a meal, even keeping attuned to an ongoing conversation can become increasingly difficult. So it's not just purely a disorder of memory. There are many different aspects of the cognitive dysfunction that an individual with Alzheimer's will experience. And as I've mentioned earlier, we're also interested in a population that falls under the rubric of frontotemporal dementia. So I'm interested in semantic knowledge, and this is our general knowledge of the world around us. So we have a myriad concepts and constructs that give us conceptual knowledge of the world and all of its different colours, sounds, tastes, smells, everything falls under this rubric. So, for example, a banana will denote many different aspects of semantic knowledge. It's laid down in different interconnected networks that will denote different related nodes of a semantic network. We carry around this huge repository of semantic knowledge, most of which we can't remember exactly when we acquired it, so it lacks the spatial and temporal specificity of episodic memory. But what's important to note is that semantic knowledge is essential for episodic retrieval. So if you think about the first time maybe that you went to London and you had a wonderful holiday there, enmeshed within that memory will be a whole raft of semantic conceptual knowledge pertaining to the construct of London. So all of the different aspects of semantic knowledge that you may not have experienced at the time, but that helped you actually flesh out that memory of when you were there. So we know that semantic memory and episodic memory are not mutually exclusive categories. In fact, they interact and are interdependent and support each other. And we are very privileged to work with a syndrome at the Brain and Mind Centre called semantic dementia, which, as the name would suggest, is a syndrome in which semantic knowledge of the world is degraded. So these patients and individuals will come into the clinic complaining of a loss of memory for words or loss of memory for objects. But really, when we start to probe their understanding, their underlying complaints, we see that it's a profound loss of their general conceptual knowledge of the world around them. So this can manifest in sometimes what's referred to as empty speech. So there's a marked anomia where they can't use nouns or naming words for things. A loss of understanding as to what the construct actually means. So an individual might look at a picture of a zebra and wonder why the horse has stripes on it. And this can make communicating and just general everyday life extremely difficult. But what's interesting is that there are a range of different cognitive functions that remain intact in this syndrome, one of which is recent episodic memory. So even though our patients are showing a profound loss of semantic knowledge, they can encode and retrieve recent experiences. So they're an excellent group to try and study how these two memory systems interact and what that tells us about the organization of memory systems in the brain. And as you can see from this diagram here, The atrophy in semantic dementia is typically lateralized to the left-hand side of the brain. So it starts in the anterior temporal lobes and eventually will spread to a bilateral, so moving to the contralateral hemisphere. But in general, we see this classic left lateralized picture whereby the anterior temporal lobes are most vulnerable to atrophy. So one of the studies that we've looked at initially was at the encoding of new information in these two populations. So the group in yellow are semantic dementia, the group who've lost their semantic knowledge of the world. And we have an Alzheimer's group in green. And we've asked our patients to try and learn new verbal information, so word lists, and also visual information, so the copying and retrieving of a complex figure that you can't assign any semantic label to. And so in this study, we showed that verbal memory was impaired in both of our groups. So this would suggest that there's a problem in actually laying down new verbal information. But what was very interesting is that the episodic memory complaints in semantic dementia appear to be modality specific. So what I mean by that is that we see when we test them in a non-verbal manner, their semantic knowledge isn't taxed, and actually their encoding of a non-verbal or a non-semantic figure is perfectly in line with that of healthy age-matched controls. So we see that visual memory is actually relatively well preserved in semantic dementia, but verbal memory is not. So this has implications for how we assess memory in the clinic. And so we also see that area highlighted in red is the hippocampus. So we see that the hippocampal atrophy in semantic dementia is as stark as that observed in Alzheimer's disease. But on the verbal or on the visual memory scale, we actually see that the hippocampus doesn't seem to be involved in semantic dementia. So this suggests that new learning can actually occur even in the face of marked hippocampal atrophy in this syndrome, provided you circumvent the semantic constraints or the semantic deficits. So again, this is very important for our clinical understanding of how we actually test memory. But that's all well and good. We don't generally tend to learn lists of words in everyday life. What we're more interested in is our sort of ecologically valid or naturalistic remembering of the past. And the best way to really assess this is via autobiographical memory. So this is the area of memory that I'm most interested in. This is our personal life story. These are the memories that we carry around with us that define who we are as individuals. So this can range from your first day at school, your graduation day, first kiss, all the way up to your wedding day. And this is the stage that I'm at the moment. I have a 5-month-old at home. So your birth of your children and all of those other wonderful experiences. And so autobiographical memory is one of the most complex forms of memory that we have. These memories are not just static facts. These are imbued with rich visual, sensory, perceptual information. There's emotional flavor that's overlaid on top of the event. When you remember these events, sometimes they'll give you shivers or tingles when you think back to that original, rich, evocative experience. These are the memories that appear to be most vulnerable in many of our dementia conditions that we study. So we need to understand the neural circuitry that's modulating these events and also what we can do to perhaps bolster or support these events. And so we've been using a technique called the autobiographical interview, which was developed by colleagues in Toronto. And basically, this interview allows us to probe discrete aspects of autobiographical memory and to code it then in terms of the level of perceptual detail that our participants are providing. And so to give you an example with one of the most common events that people will describe, so a wedding day, typically an individual will describe who was there, where the event took place, the various players and sort of different objects and actions that happened. They'll situate it within a rich and unique spatial framework, but they may also try to give you extra contextual padding. So they may tell you that they were engaged in Paris. They may start to describe that they went on honeymoon off in the Caribbean. And all of these details get thrown into the one narrative, and we have to try and dissect and decode different aspects of that original experience. And so for the purposes of autobiographical retrieval, we actually focus on the events that are specific to that day in question. So we try to time lock to the wedding day itself and to not pay attention to the extra contextual information such as the honeymoon in the Caribbean or the engagement in Paris. And we look across different time periods to enable us to study the effects of time on autobiographical memory and its underlying neural circuitry. So we can look at the recent period within the last year, and sometimes we'll aggregate the other time periods to look at remote memory, so memories that are much older in time, and see is there a difference qualitatively and also quantitatively between recent versus remote memory. So in an early study that we conducted, we actually found that the profiles of autobiographical memory in different dementia syndromes differ depending on the recent time period. And that group that's highlighted there in yellow, again, is the semantic dementia group. So they actually showed an increase in their recent memory details. They showed that they were able to retrieve recent memories in much more sensory perceptual detail than remote memories. And this is the only group that we have found this effect in, and it seems to be quite a well-documented effect in the literature. And so we've looked at this more closely, and it's speaking to the fact that not all of our memories are created equal. Recent memories seem to be a special class of memory all by themselves. So we see again in a follow-up study that recent memory was actually relatively intact in the semantic dementia group, even when we account for the fact that they can't produce semantic details to embellish their autobiographical retrieval. Interestingly, we found a double dissociation. We found that in semantic dementia, recent memory was better recalled than remote memory, but in Alzheimer's disease, older memories were better recalled than the recent period. And again, this meshes with many of the accounts that we hear from our patients, whereby an Alzheimer's individual will find it much easier to retrieve details from their childhood or their early adulthood. So we wanted to look on the neural level and see, well, what are the brain mechanisms that might give rise to these different profiles of memory? And so here we're looking at voxel-based morphometry results. So this is looking at structural brain scans and drawing associations between grey matter in the brain and performance on the autobiographical test. And so in Alzheimer's disease, we found that hippocampal atrophy was driving autobiographical memory disturbances irrespective of the time period that we were looking at. So remote memories, if you have hippocampal atrophy, that's related to your remote memory deficits and also recent memories. But what's very interesting, if you look at the image for the recent period, we found the correlation between a region deep in the posterior parietal cortices, that's near the back of the brain in the midline. And this region correlated exclusively with their recent memory impairments. And so this region for me, I think, is really important to understand in the genesis of memory deficits in Alzheimer's disease. We know that hypometabolism and amyloid deposition actually preferentially target the posterior cingulate cortex from very early on in the Alzheimer's trajectory, even before the overt clinical complaints have manifested. And so you'll see this region will keep coming up throughout the talk, and I think it's important that we start to look more away from the hippocampus towards more posterior parietal regions. But in terms of the semantic dementia group, we actually found that nothing correlated with the recent time period because they were showing performance that was in line with controlled performance. And what's interesting is that their remote retrieval deficits, so these are their inability to remember older memories, correlated with those regions of the brain that support semantic knowledge. So this is suggesting that as our memories are older, they undergo a transformation. They become less episodic and they become more factual and more abstracted. And I think this makes sense if you think back to some of your memories from the past, such as going to school. It's very difficult to actually pinpoint a precise event. It's more likely that you'll think about what generally happened and provide the broad schematic, unless you had some very emotionally durable event of being hauled up in front of the principal, and then the emotion would serve to actually keep that preserved as an episodic memory. So one thing that we wanted to look at was what is the fate of these memories over time? We know a lot about cross-sectional memory complaints in dementia, but very few studies have been conducted looking to see how these processes evolve with advancing disease pathology. And so from that original study that I've presented, we actually brought as many of our participants back in 1 year later. We retested them on quite this onerous autobiographical memory interview, rescored all of their narratives, and they also underwent another brain imaging scan. And we wanted to see, do memories stabilize over time? Do they keep progressing in this sort of ongoing pathological insult? What happens? Are there some aspects of memory that are preserved or spared? And nobody had actually looked at this before. And what we found very interestingly in the Alzheimer's group was we didn't find any evidence of an overt decline from time period 1 to time period 2. It seemed that our Alzheimer patients were able to provide the same amount of detail even 1 year later as they had in the original test session. But the neural underpinnings of these memory profiles differed markedly. So we found that over time, there was much more involvement of the lateral temporal cortices. Again, these are the regions that support semantic knowledge in the brain. And we found that correlations between neuropsychological assessments of general semantic knowledge correlated extremely strongly with their memory performance at follow-up. So basically, this suggests that there's a shift in Alzheimer's disease from an evocative episodic representation towards a much more schematicized or abstract or semantic fact. And this may be one way in which the brain is sort of supporting the retrieval of the schema or the overall crux of the event in the absence of the event details itself. And it may serve to actually provide a skeleton or a framework that the patient can continue to draw upon in the absence of rich contextual detail. So it's something that I think is quite important if we want to try and understand how to support or to augment memory function as the disease is eroding and encroaching into adjacent brain areas, that there does seem to be some residual semantic abstraction of events that we could potentially work with in Alzheimer's disease. So to conclude from the past, we know that autobiographical memory is an incredibly rich and complex construct. It's supported by multiple regions in the brain, all of which center onto the hippocampus. And we know that there are core regions that are implicated irrespective of how old your memory is. So even if you're recalling from an event that happened to you when you were 8 years old or to something that happened to you yesterday, your hippocampus seems to be crucial for this process. But there are also time-sensitive regions. So we found that the posterior cingulate cortex, here in green, seems to be particularly sensitive to the recency of memories. So for recent events, this region seems to be crucial, and it may be that it's so strongly connected to visual regions near the back of the brain and self-referential connotations that perhaps this is something that augments our recent memory performance. We also know that the lateral temporal cortices of the brain are semantic repositories, and these seem to be much more sensitive to older memories, which, as we found out through our Alzheimer's work, may actually be more like semanticized or semantic representations. So it seems that our older memories are transformed into much more factual or gist-based accounts, and this then becomes more likely to be supported by the lateral temporal cortices. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we're also going to think about what the function of memory might actually be. So from an evolutionary perspective, it's important to question why we would carry with us these very evocative, very emotionally salient and durable memories. Does it make sense from an evolutionary perspective that we would always look to the past? Well, in fact, there's been a recent paradigm shift within the field of episodic memory research that would suggest that, in fact, memory is not past-oriented at all. And in fact, memory evolved to enable us to imagine the future. And so it sort of turned the whole idea of memory on its head, that in fact, the reason why we've evolved to have a memory system of this nature at all is to enable us to draw on past experience with the purpose of anticipating and predicting and then adapting our behavior. And so one of the forerunners of this idea would be that in terms of agriculture and the development and evolution of agriculture, the ability to plant a seed and then envisage that that seed would ultimately develop and you return to the exact spatial location where you planted the seed, all required sort of that ability to envisage after a delay and return to predict that this would have an outcome. And we do this every day. We predict, we draw upon our past experiences, we try to anticipate and to evolve and to adapt our behaviors. And so the future of memory really is that memory is not a past-oriented system at all. Memory is all about the future. So that might seem somewhat counterintuitive, but that's where we're moving in terms of the episodic memory work. So the evolutionary significance of memory is that we have this memory system which enables us to be flexible, to adapt and to change based on our past experiences. And so Doctor Who is not the only one who can mentally time travel. We can all do that. But it turns out that we have a neural TARDIS. located in under our skulls. So a really seminal piece of work by Donna Rose Addis at the University of Toronto showed in 2007 that when healthy individuals retrieve these autobiographical memories from their past, they're activating the same regions and the same network of brain regions as when they envisage events that would occur possibly in the future. There is very little difference between the neural machinery that activates for past retrieval and that which supports our ability to envisage the future. And so this was quite a remarkable finding at the time, and it led to this whole outpouring of conjecture and speculation as to why would we use the same memory systems for remembering and imagining. And it seems that we use the same cognitive processes and the same neural mechanisms, irrespective of whether we're retrieving the past or trying to envisage or imagine the future. And so one of the key theories that's emerged in this regard is the fact that when we try to envisage the future, so whenever we try to anticipate or to predict, what we do is we dip back into our episodic experiences. We look back over past exemplars. We try to think about what's happened in the past. And then we extract out those details that may be relevant and flexibly recombine them to think about a new simulation or to think about things in a new and novel way. So it seems that episodic memory is particularly important if we're trying to envisage new events in the future. And by the same token, damage to the episodic memory system then would be predicted to impair our capacity to envisage the future. And this is exactly what we see in many clinical populations, such as depression, mild cognitive impairment, and Alzheimer's disease, that when there is damage to the episodic memory system, it produces a parallel impairment in the ability to imagine the future. And so we've taken this line of inquiry further, and we've started to explore how future thinking or future simulation might be impacted in semantic dementia. So this is the population where their recent memories remain relatively intact. And so by some of the main theories out there, we may have predicted that they should be able to simulate the future because they have a rich episodic memory store available to them. But in fact, in a study that we conducted in 2012, we found that they were as impaired as individuals with Alzheimer's disease. And this was quite an unusual finding because we really did think that they should be able to harness their episodic memory store. In fact, we showed that they have asymmetric impairments across past and future contexts. So even though they can retrieve their episodic details from the past, this isn't enough to enable them to envisage the future. And we explored again the regions that were correlating with these impairments using voxel-based morphometry. And we found that, again, in the Alzheimer's group in red, the posterior cingulate seemed to be particularly important. So again, this region that I highlighted as being important in recent episodic memory is also crucial for an Alzheimer's patient to be able to envisage the near future. But in semantic dementia, in yellow, it was actually a strong association between those semantic knowledge regions in the left anterior temporal lobe. So again, this was the first piece of the puzzle to suggest that semantic knowledge is crucial to enable us to envisage or think about the future. And when we look to what the content of these simulations are, when we actually go back to what the patients are actually telling us, that provides a very rich store of information for us. So this is a transcript from one of the semantic dementia group who took part in the original study. And he was describing to me the next time he might go out for dinner with a friend. So he starts off by saying, well, on Thursday night, I'm having a meal with my friends. But then he defaulted back to his episodic memory store and told me about the last time that this happened and that he imagined that it would go something similar to that, but this time maybe they'd go for Middle Eastern food. So this says to us that there's an over-reliance on the episodic memory traces that are intact in the absence of semantic knowledge. That means the patients are inevitably constrained by their past experiences. And we've suggested in a number of theoretical formulations that having a recently experienced event that you can draw on in the absence of semantic knowledge means that our patients actually just recapitulate their experiences from the past. They're taking an event that they know has already experienced and saying, oh, it'll happen like that again. So they're recasting their events. And we found that 80% of the events generated by our semantic dementia group were actually just purely recast from the past. So the loss of semantic memory seems to compromise the novelty of the simulations that these patients are able to generate. And we find in their daily behavior, it's quite interesting, that our semantic dementia patients become incredibly concrete and rigid and adhering to routines. So it seems that the loss of semantic memory may actually confer a loss of flexibility in thought and in behavior. And this is something that I'm keen to follow up with. We've also started to look at the role of spatial representations in how we remember and imagine. And so we've been doing some really interesting work looking at how we construct scenes in our mind's eye. So invariably, when you think about an event, it's typically located within a spatial array. And so scenes have been suggested to be a really important part, in fact, the currency of memory and imagination. And so we've been using this really great task where we ask our participants to imagine that they're either lying on a deserted white sandy beach, or they're walking through a marketplace, they're in a castle, all of these sort of familiar commonplace scenes, and they're simply asked to describe the scenes in as much detail as they can. And we really weren't sure what would happen in our Alzheimer patient group. Would they be able to generate scenes? Would they be able to use semantic knowledge to populate their representations? Or would the whole process be degraded because of their episodic memory deficits? And so in a study we published a number of years ago, we actually found that patients with Alzheimer's disease have marked difficulty in generating scenes that are very simple and commonplace, such as a forest, a park, and in fact they score markedly lower relative to controls in terms of the details that they can provide, the sensory elements that they can integrate into the scene, and their own subjective ratings of how vivid or how detailed the scene is. Patients tended to say that the scenes were not scenes at all. They were actually more like static photos or images with discontinuity between each clip. So it wasn't playing out like a smooth, continuous video clip. It was more like disjointed black and white images that were fragmented. They didn't feel like they had any sense of presence in the scene, and it was more that they were just describing a general gist of what the scene might contain. And again, their impoverished scene descriptions reflected atrophy in the posterior cingulate cortex of the brain. So again, we're showing all of this convergent evidence pointing towards a region back in the parietal cortex that hasn't really been considered in depth in relation to some of these processes, and how crucial it seems to be in modulating many of the impairments that we see in Alzheimer's disease in terms of remembering the past, imagining the future, and also constructing scenes. But something I was interested in was, would a patient with semantic dementia be able to construct scenes in their mind's eye? So we've shown that they're able to remember recent experiences, but unable to imagine possible experiences that might occur in the near future. So we weren't quite sure what the prediction would be. We thought, let's try and see, can a patient with semantic dementia in relatively early stages of the disease generate these relatively simple scenes? So we studied patient G, who was presenting very early in the semantic dementia disease course. He had great insight into his deficits, and his semantic deficits weren't as pronounced as would preclude testing on these types of measures. He showed the classic semantic dementia profile in terms of cognitive deficits, and this is his scan showing atrophy that's lateralized to the left anterior temporal lobe of the brain. So I was fortunate enough to have conducted the testing with patient G, and I don't think I would have believed the results if I hadn't actually been sitting beside him when I did the testing. But he generated the most beautiful, perceptually laden scenes out of any of the participants I had tested. He was describing being on the beach, showing the light filtering through the water. He had very evocative imagery. He felt that he had a strong sense of presence. It was vivid. He felt he did a good job, and he scored remarkably highly on this measure. The scenes were experienced by him in colour. There was no fragmentation. They played out smoothly as a continuous scene, and he had all of the requisite elements to score extremely highly on this task. So patient G is the red square that's embedded within all of the other control points there on these figures. You can see he's sitting wonderfully in line with the rest of the control participants. So he can produce spatially coherent, complex scenes. But we wondered, was this something to do with laterality? So patient G's atrophy was confined to the left-hand side of the brain. It was only impacting his left anterior temporal lobes and his left hippocampus. In some of the literature looking at activation in healthy individuals, we see an important role for the right hippocampus. And we were very fortunate that we had tested a patient with atrophy that was actually lateralized to the right. So this offered a unique opportunity to contrast the role of the left and the right hippocampus in scene construction. So we had patient D, who you can see there has atrophy confined to his right anterior hippocampus. And so, as we've already shown, patient G could achieve or accomplish really rich evocative descriptions of contextually rich scenes. Patient D, if you can see the little triangle right at the bottom there of the graph, he was markedly impoverished on this task. He couldn't generate scenes, he couldn't generate the descriptions. And in fact, when we looked at his actual scene descriptions, he tended to focus in on the microscopic elements of the scene. He was telling me about the texture of the grains of sand on the beach without being able to provide the panorama or the overall scene description. So there's a scaling issue in terms of what he's able to achieve. And so it suggests that the left and the right hippocampi are doing markedly different processes in contributing to these scene descriptions. So patient G can do this panoramic view. He can give you a contextually rich description of a scene, but patient D, with atrophy to his right hippocampus, is unable to move beyond the perceptual immediate features. And so one final area of research that I want to describe today is this idea of recasting that I mentioned earlier. So we found that our patients with semantic dementia are unable to generate novel scenes. It seemed that they would default to the experiences that they'd already had that were familiar to them from their own personal timeline. The events that they do describe in the future tend to be recast. So they take an event in its entirety from the past and simply transplant it into the future and change the tense. They're not able to provide anything novel, which suggests that they may be bound by their past experiences and also suggests a reason for some of their stereotypical and quite rigid behavior. But one thing I wanted to investigate was whether patients with semantic dementia could provide unique and novel events, and if we really constrain them to deviate away from their past experience and try to create something that's highly implausible. And so we had quite a lot of fun developing this task, where we actually asked our participants to go to the moon. And so we had to check in advance whether our participants had watched any documentaries about moon landings or had been watching any features on space travel to ensure that their episodic memories weren't contaminated and that could possibly influence the results. So we wanted to really probe and push our participants to go beyond the realm of their past experiences and to generate something novel. And presumably this should tax their semantic memory system much more than our previous paradigms had. And so what we found was that our semantic dementia patients, when we compared their capacity to construct plausible versus implausible events such as the moon, we find that they have disproportionate difficulties in the implausible condition. When you take them away from their episodic experiences, they're unable to provide you with what might happen if they went to the moon. We found that our control participants didn't show this difference. They found it just as easy to develop and to simulate being on the moon as thinking about Christmas next year. So there's something about event implausibility that's differentially impaired in semantic dementia, which means that being able to generate implausible, highly unlikely events, novelty and creativity must depend on the semantic memory system. And I think, again, one of the best ways of understanding what's happening in our participants is to look at what they're actually providing. So it's all well and good for us to code their narratives according to contextual detail, but I find that often it's the words and the language that they use that's the most informative. So this is an example from one of our healthy, older control participants. So they're talking about landing on the moon, that it would be dusty, the landscape is not smooth, it's sort of bumpy and rocky. You wouldn't have gravity, so you'd sort of bounce along in an eerie sort of light rather than broad sunlight. It's sort of a brownish colour. There might be a clear view of the sky, and you'd look out into the stars and space. So it's quite evocative, and you can feel that the person is actually really placing themselves on the surface of the moon and looking back. I had some participants actually break down into tears as they found the experience so evocative and so emotional and highly arousing. Now, if we contrast that with a patient with semantic dementia, I think this is wonderful. So they know what the construct of moon is, but they lack that knowledge to actually give you a good, perceptually vivid and rich account. So they say, I'm not exactly sure what you'd be doing, but I don't think you would be doing a lot. Might just be looking back to Earth. Well, it'd be very unusual. It'd probably be something you'd be able to talk about when you get home, because we see it all the time, don't we? It's a long way away, though. So it suggests that they have a fundamental grasp of what the moon is, but they don't have the episodic exemplars or the episodic experience to actually populate and to give you a rich and sensory perceptual description of that. And then this was the clincher. I nearly shouted eureka, because this person said, I honestly don't know because I've never been there. So it's just a beautiful way of them saying, look, I don't have the episodic memory for this, so I can't actually describe any further. So now we're starting to chase down the neural substrates of these differential impairments in plausible and implausible events, and how it relates to our schemas of the world around us, and how we actually behave and draw upon our past experiences to guide our future behavior. And I think some of this work is going to prove particularly informative in showing us how these patients start to cling to routines and to become very stereotyped in their behaviors and rigid. And I think there's a lot that we can take not only from informing our understanding of theoretical models of memory, but also helping us to understand the behavioral trajectories of some of our patients. And so finally, I think, given that I've come from quite a personal experience with dementia, I always want to try and bring my work back to somehow informing ways that we can sort of ameliorate or support or improve the quality of life and well-being of our participants. And so one area that we're at the moment currently looking at is prospective memory. So I mentioned earlier that this is our memory, remembering to do things. I must remember to pick up milk. I must remember to take my medication. And so we're wondering how prospective memory failures might actually impact on safety and well-being around the house in terms of making decisions later in life, which are so important to consider in the context of dementia. Decision-making in terms of advanced care directives, in terms of end-of-life care and decisions that we possibly put off until it's too late and the person has lost capacity to make informed choices about themselves. And also in terms of financial planning, work from our group has shown that patients with dementia are actually quite vulnerable to financial scams. We're hearing a lot about elder abuse in the community, and we need to sort of find a way to understand how to promote effective decision making and to ensure that vulnerability of these patients is not taken advantage of. And also one area that I'm very interested in is thinking about how the loss of being able to think about and simulate the future impacts on the individual themselves and their own subjective experience. If you couldn't think about yourself in the future, what does that mean for you as an individual? How does that impact your sense of motivation? How does it impact your mood, your ability to connect with other people, and your ability to stay motivated in daily life? I think there's a lot that we don't understand in terms of the subjective experience of the individual living with dementia, and we may have to try new ways of sort of teasing apart how the loss of being able to navigate and think about yourself as an individual over time, how that impacts their day-to-day activities, interpersonal connection, and their sense of self. And one case study that really struck me as being quite influential in this sphere was a case study of a semantic dementia patient who was very aware of his inability to not be able to simulate the future. And so he described to the researchers that he was unable to think of himself. Who would I be? Where would I go? Who am I if I don't have a future? And this actually culminated in a very severe depression and multiple suicide attempts, because the patient basically realized that he couldn't see himself as a continuing entity in subjective time, and that gave rise to a marked depression. And as This quote, I think, very eloquently surmises depression is the inability to construct a future. So if we don't have that capacity to see ourselves as an individual that's progressing and navigating through time, what does that mean, and how can we actually support these functions in patients who've lost that capacity? So these are all very provocative questions that we're slowly trying to chip away on and understand in order to, I think, promote a better quality of life and hopefully improve well-being in our patients living with dementia and also their family members as well. So I think that was a bit of a whirlwind tour through the archives of memory and imagination and some of the work that we've been doing at the Brain and Mind Centre. I just want to acknowledge the role of the participants, our patients and their family members, who are extremely generous with their time. They come in and do all of these cognitive tests that probably seem quite far-fetched and not very relevant to their day-to-day living. And without their involvement and their generosity, this work would not be possible. My team at the Frontier Dementia Research Group at the Brain and Mind Centre, and my various collaborators and funding bodies. And then this is my team, the Memory and Imagination in Neurological Disorders Group, the MIND team. We need to take a new photo because we've actually expanded quite a lot since that one was taken. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We've got time for a couple of short questions, if there are any. So,
you mentioned that one of the types of dementia was related to vascular issues. Is that related to ischemic disease where the arteries are aggressively blocked?
Yeah, so there is a big link between cardiovascular risk and dementia. So that's why one of the lifestyle modifiable factors that we can actually attend to is reducing our cardiovascular risk. There's also a link between stroke and dementia. So there are definitely vascular changes that we need to monitor, but there are also ones that we can potentially augment and reduce as well through modifiable lifestyle factors.
Yes, you talk about the here and now and the present and going forwards. Do you look backwards to see what can cause some of these problems? And I'll give you two examples. I had a mother who died at 96, but from the age of early 80s, she said, I will not have intervention on a life-threatening event because I've seen too many of my friends come back vegetables. And we adhered to that, and she died with a very sharp brain, frail body, sharp brain. I have a wife who had breast cancer at 51, now 70, and has part of the Brain and Mind Centre research projects. And I sort of think, what has caused this? And I reached out to a friend many years ago and when we first became aware there were issues, and it started probably 15 years ago. And she reached out to a psychiatrist she knew who worked in that area. And one question came back, and it was, has she had chemo? And the answer was yes. And back came an article on chemo brain. What sort of research is being done on medical intervention on people? Because as we get older, we all suffer, a lot of us will suffer from cancers, a lot of us will suffer, need operations of whatever. What sort of impact has been looked at on, or what sort of research has been looked at on the impact of past medical procedures that may well be affecting our future mental health?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. It's extremely difficult to answer, but I think you're right that as we age, we're more likely to have undergone different procedures like general anaesthesia. And there's been a whole literature looking at how anaesthetic may be a risk factor for subsequent development of dementia. The only issue is with these studies is that they're associational, so they're correlational, and we can't determine causation. And so what we're trying to do now, so many of the international consortia are trying to do more prospective work to actually start following individuals from their mid-40s and start tracking them over time to see how different experiences, interventions, illnesses may confer some kind of vulnerability or not. We still don't know as to the likelihood of developing dementia. We don't even know within healthy, normal population who've never had any of these experiences, how we can predict their risk to succumb to dementia. It's so fraught with various genetic, lifestyle, environmental factors, that there still is no simple way of predicting who at time X may eventuate to develop dementia. But I do think you're making an important point, that there are a host of different interventions and treatments that we fully don't understand how it actually confers a vulnerability or not in terms of our likelihood of getting dementia.
So I'm going to have to draw it a little bit to a close there, because I know there's a promise to finish at 9 and we're already past 9, so I apologise. Hopefully you'll be around for a few more minutes so that the people who do have questions can do that. But I agree with you. This is at the real frontier of what we just don't know. And I think there's a lot to be said. So let's all thank Muireann again for a wonderful talk.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Really good. Can I just very briefly say that our next breakfast seminar will be held on the 28th of November. It will be the last for the year, when renowned Finnish education expert Pasi Salberg of the Gonski Institute will be talking about the Finnish lessons in increasing equity and opportunity in the education system. So please, we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.